Welcome to Study Simple CBSE. Today let's look at the line-by-line explanation of the chapter A Triumph of Surgery from Class 10th English. Now let's begin the video. The author of Triumph of Surgery is James Alfred White. He was known by the pen name James Herriot, was a British veterinary surgeon and writer who used his many years of experience as a veterinary surgeon to write a series of books consisting of stories about animals and their owners. Now let's begin the chapter A Triumph of Surgery. So what is triumph? Triumph is victory or winning over something. And surgery means operation. But in this chapter it means like a hospital. We know that the author is a veterinary surgeon. So this is one of the story of how he treated an animal. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. So the narrator is just moving in his car, and at that time he saw Tricky. Tricky is a pet dog which was owned by a rich lady. So he saw Tricky walking with his mistress. Mistress is the rich lady or the owner. So the author states that he was shocked by the appearance of Tricky. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. So when he gave a look at Tricky, he noticed that he was hugely fat. And he was also looking like a bloated sausage. So you know how a sausage looks like. If you keep the sausage in water, then it becomes bloated. That's what bloated is. The sausage will expand by taking all the water in it. So that is called as bloated. And as if two legs were inserted at both the corners. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So the author is saying that the eyes of Tricky were bloodshot and rheumy. So what is bloodshot? It means that his eyes were completely red. And rheumy means it was watery. So his eyes were red and watery. He stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws, which means that his tongue was just rolling out of his mouth. So his tongue is just hanging like that. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. So Mrs. Pumphrey is the rich lady or the owner of Tricky. Hastened means hurried. So Mrs. Pumphrey hurried to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. So what does listless mean? It means without any interest. So she's saying that Tricky had no interest, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I've been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So she is trying to explain to Mr. Herriot why the dog has become so fat or so bloated. She says that she thought that the dog was suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition means getting lack of nutritious food. So she thought that she would provide him some extra meals, leaving the regular meals which Tricky had. So what were the extra things which she was giving? It was some malt, cod liver oil and also a bowl of Horlicks so that Tricky can sleep at night. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? So as a doctor, he's asking her if she cut down or did not give him any sweet things. Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. So she replies that, so she says that she did stop giving it sweet food for some time, but then seeing how weak Tricky had become, she had to give him. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. So Mrs. Pumphrey says to Mr. Herriot that her dog loves to eat cream cakes and chocolates, so she can never refuse to give it to him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Now Mr. Herriot looks down at the dog and figures out what was the problem. Tricky had been eating too much food and especially the sweet things also made him very bloated or fat. Tricky's only fault was greed. So the fault of Tricky was it was very greedy, which means that it never said no to anything and it just kept eating. He had never been known to refuse food, which means that whatever food you give to the dog, it never refuses it. It just eats it. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night, which means that Tricky would eat any meal at any hour of the day or night. Whether you give it at the night, it won't care, it would just eat the food. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. And then Mr. Harriet started wondering about all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned about Tricky. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? So now Mr. Harriet asks her if she has been giving him plenty of exercise. Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago. So there has been nothing throwing lately. So she replies by saying that he has his little walks with me, as you can see. So Tricky would have some little walks, but Hodkin, she also mentions about the gardener of their house. Hodkin has been down with lumbago. So lumbago is a disease which causes pain in your lower back. So she says that their gardener has been suffering from lumbago. So there has been nothing throwing lately, which means that Tricky has not been getting plenty of exercise lately. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. So now Mr. Harriet is being serious and he says that now I really mean this, and continues by saying that if you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. So he's saying that you can't be with your emotions anymore and you need to keep him on a very strict diet. That is, you should give him very less food and give him plenty of exercise. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands, which is she is starting to become very nervous because it is very difficult for her to be strict with her Tricky dog. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. So the woman says to Mr. Harriet that she'll try to be as strict as possible, but she's also saying that it is very difficult for her to be so strict with her lovely dog. She's saying that it is difficult because she pampers it a lot and she loves it a lot and she can never refuse whatever the dog wants. She set off head down along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So now she goes out of the clinic and with her head down along the road, and she is very determined to put the new regime, what is regime, routine, into practice immediately. So now with her head down she is going along the road because she is feeling very sad since she has to put in a new routine for the welfare of her dog, which would be very hard on the dog. Watch their progress with growing concern. So this shows that Mr. Harriet was very concerned about the dog and its health. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats. So Tricky was just walking along in his little tweed coat. Tweed means it's like rough woolen material. So Tricky was walking along in his woolen coat. So Tricky had a complete wardrobe consisting of these kinds of coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. So he had clothes for different weathers, may it be the cold weather or a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. So Tricky struggled to walk, drooping in his harness, which means decreasing his control. Drooping means decreasing and harness means control. It means that he was not able to walk properly and he was struggling to walk. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. And Harriet knows that looking at the condition of Tricky, he would soon get a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Now, as expected, he got the call within a few days after Tricky and his owner left the hospital. And when they got the call, he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey was really very worried. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. So, bouts means like a series or sessions of vomiting. And Tricky never ate his food. Even his favorite food, he would never eat it now. He spent all his time lying on a rug panting. So this means that Tricky was lying in his rug all day and panting, which means breathing very difficultly. Didn't want to go for walks and didn't want to do anything. So Tricky just wanted to lie in one place. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. So when Mr. Harriet heard all the problems of Tricky, he realized that the only solution would be to take him out of the house for a little period of time. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. So he says that for at least 2 weeks he needs to be hospitalized. The poor lady almost swooned, which means that she almost fainted because she loved her dog so much that she could not leave it away in the hospital for a fortnight, for 2 weeks. So the lady almost fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. So she thought that the dog would pine and die. Pine and die means it would yearn for something and die if he didn't see her every day. But I took a firm line. So I here is Mr. Harriet. So he's saying after all this, if you want to save Tricky, then you have to leave him at the hospital. Tricky was very ill and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So he had actually gone to the house to see how the dog was doing. So he heard what Mrs. Pumphrey had to say, and now as soon as that he took the dog with him in his car. But when he started walking towards his car, Mrs. Pumphrey started wailing. Wailing means crying, because she could not leave her dog. So what did he do? He wrapped the little dog in a blanket and marched out towards his car. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out bringing his daybed, his nightbed, his favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl and supper bowl. So now we know that Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady, so her entire staff was roused, and the maids went in and brought all these things for the dog. His daybed, his nightbed, his favorite cushions, his toys, rubber rings, and he had 3 different bowls for 3 different meals: breakfast bowl, lunch bowl and supper bowl. And they put all these things inside the car of Mr. Harriet as the dog was going to the hospital. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. So now Mr. Harriet realizes that all these things would never fit in his car, so he starts to drive away. As I moved on, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coats through the window. But when Mr. Harriet was going, Mrs. Pumphrey brought in a handful of little coats, and she was shouting and crying, and she put it inside the window of the car. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So while driving, he looks back and sees that everybody was crying. All the staff and even Mrs. Pumphrey was also crying since Tricky was being taken away to the hospital. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. So while driving, he looked at the animal and with great difficulty it was trying to sit on the seat. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. So since he was a vet, he knew how to make animals happy. So he patted the head of Tricky and it made an effort to wag its tail. So when does a dog wag its tail? When it's very happy. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So he looked at the dog and said that, I know you have no energy at all, but I know how to come up with a solution to cure you. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. And saying these things, he reached the surgery. Surgery here means the hospital or the pet clinic. So there were many dogs in the hospital. All those dogs came and surrounded him as soon as he entered the clinic or the hospital. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and when put down lay motionless on the carpet. So even after looking at all these dogs which were filled with energy, it still did not feel interested in doing anything. And it lay motionless on the carpet when Mr. Harriet landed him on the ground. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So the other dogs immediately came and surrounded around Tricky and started sniffing around him. What is sniffing? Sniffing means smelling with their nose. But then after a few seconds they thought that Tricky was very uninteresting. So they ignored him and moved away. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dog slept. So the narrator makes a bed for Tricky next to the other dogs in a box. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, which means that for 2 complete days Mr. Harriet kept watching Tricky, giving him no food but plenty of water. So the author just gave him water and no food at all for 2 days. We'll complete the remaining part of the chapter in the next video. Thanks for watching.